In the mist-choked jungles of northern Vietnam, a captured American sergeant was about to face his worst nightmare. A routine patrol turned deadly when Viet Cong ambushers encircled his platoon with brutal precision. Sergeant Will Mercer wasn't your typical infantryman. For 3 years, he was part of the U.S. military's Blackbird program, an elite covert unit specializing in psychological warfare, escape, and evasion, known for orchestrating impossible breakouts deep behind enemy lines. When the Viet Cong executed a flawless ambush and dragged his men into a shadowy jungle prison, they had no idea they were locking up a ghost trained to vanish. Mercer began a silent, calculated resistance, mapping the camp, outwitting his watchers, and building trust with unlikely allies that would trigger a chain reaction of chaos across enemy territory. What began as a slaughter would become a war of minds. The jungle compound would never be the same after one prisoner turned the entire camp into his hunting ground. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The humidity hung like a second skin, clinging to Sergeant Will Mercer as he led his platoon through the dense Vietnamese jungle. Sweat tracked down his spine, pooling at the small of his back. His uniform was a sodden mess, had been for days, but that discomfort existed only at the periphery of his awareness. His focus remained razor-sharp, scanning the tree line, noting the too-perfect stillness of the underbrush. "You always this jumpy, Sarge?" Corporal Ray Danner, text to everyone who'd served with him longer than 5 minutes, swatted at a mosquito on his neck, leaving a smear of blood. Will didn't turn. "Not jumpy, cautious. 6 months in country and I still can't tell the difference between jungle quiet and too quiet," Tex muttered. Will could. That was the problem. Behind them, Private Eli Rivera stumbled over an exposed root, his gear rattling. The sound cracked through the silence, and Will winced. "Sorry, Sarge," Mouse whispered, his young face flushed with embarrassment beneath the grime. At 18, he was the platoon's baby, all earnest eyes and nervous energy. Will had taken to keeping him close, a habit he couldn't fully explain to himself. "Check your noise discipline, Rivera," Staff Sergeant Boone Keller barked from the rear, "or Charlie'll hear you coming from a mile away." Will frowned but said nothing. Boone's traditional command style, all bluster and bark, worked fine back at base. Out here, it just created tension. They moved deeper into the jungle, the canopy thickening overhead, casting the ground in perpetual twilight. Will felt the familiar prickle at the base of his skull, the sensation he'd learned never to ignore. 3 years in the Blackbird program had taught him to trust those instincts. Something was wrong. "Hold," Will said, his voice barely audible. The platoon froze. "What is it?" Tex asked, rifle already raised to his shoulder. Will scanned the tree line, listening beyond the insect drone and distant bird calls. Nothing. And yet, "It's 2, he began. The world exploded. The first blast hit 20 feet ahead, ripping through the underbrush and sending a shockwave that knocked half the men off their feet. The second and third detonations came in quick succession, precisely placed to cut off retreat. Tex slammed into Will, driving them both into the mud as bullets tore through the space where they'd stood. "Contact!" someone screamed, voice already thick with pain. "Find cover!" Boone bellowed, but there was nowhere to go. Will's training kicked in. He rolled to his knees, drawing his sidearm in one fluid motion. "Mouse, on me!" he shouted, spotting the young private frozen in terror. A fourth explosion sent earth and vegetation raining down, the air filled with dust and the coppery tang of blood. Through the chaos, Will caught glimpses of figures moving through the trees, quick, disciplined shadows converging from multiple directions. "They're flanking east," Will called to Boone, who was frantically trying to organize covering. "Fire, negative." "They're coming from—" Boone's words cut off as a round caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Will grabbed Mouse by his collar, dragging him toward a hollow formed by a massive fallen tree. "Tex, here," he called. The Texan was already, firing in controlled bursts, providing cover as others scrambled for position. He backed toward Will, face set in grim determination. "It's a goddamn kill box," Tex growled. Will knew he was right. The ambush had been meticulously planned, the explosives hurting them exactly where the Viet Cong wanted them. They'd walked right into it. Mouse was shaking violently, his rifle clutched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I can't, you can," Will said, his voice calm despite the mayhem. "Focus on breathing, then shooting." A grenade arced through the air, landing 10 feet from their position. "Down!" Will shouted, throwing himself over Mouse as Tex dove behind a thick root system. The blast sent splinters of wood in all directions. Will felt a sharp pain as something tore through his right calf, but he pushed the sensation away. Pain was just information. He'd been taught how to compartmentalize it. "Retreat to the ridge," Boone was shouting, blood streaming down his arm. "Fall back by..." His orders vanished beneath a new wave of gunfire. Will made a rapid assessment. They were surrounded, outmaneuvered. Standard tactics wouldn't work. "Boone," he called, "we need to split into fire teams. Break their..." Something heavy struck the back of Will's head. The world tilted, colors inverting as he fought to maintain consciousness. He saw Mouse screaming something, Tex returning fire, and then darkness swallowed him whole. Will came to with the taste of dirt and copper in his mouth. His head throbbed, each pulse of pain accompanied by a high-pitched ringing in his ears. He kept his eyes closed, taking inventory. Arms behind his back, bound tightly. Ankles secured. The ground beneath him moved slightly. A transport of some kind, not military. The engine sounded older, the suspension worn. Voices filtered through the ringing. Vietnamese, multiple speakers. One calm and measured, the others deferential. Will risked opening his eyes to narrow slits. They were in the back of a covered truck, jostling down what felt like a rudimentary jungle road. Filtered daylight revealed 8 surviving members of his platoon, all bound, some wounded. Mouse was directly across from him, eyes wide with terror, a nasty gash across his forehead crusted with dried blood. Tex sat beside the boy, his expression unreadable beneath a mask of dirt and sweat. Boone lay unconscious nearby, his wounded shoulder wrapped in crude bandages already soaked through. A rustle of movement drew Will's attention to the front of the truck. A slender Vietnamese man in simple black clothing observed the prisoners. His face was hidden behind a featureless, black mask with only his eyes visible. They were dark and utterly still, like a bird of prey assessing potential targets. The man made no sound, no movement beyond the slight tilt of his head as he studied each prisoner in turn. Will was careful to maintain the same frightened, disoriented expression as the others when those eyes found him. Inside, his mind was already cataloging, calculating. The restraints were expertly tied, not simple jungle fighters then. The wounds had been treated just enough to keep them alive for transport. Precise, tactical. The truck lurched, and pain shot through Will's injured leg. He hissed involuntarily, drawing the masked figure's attention again. This time the man shifted slightly, moving close enough to examine Will more carefully. Will let his head loll, playing up his disorientation, but he caught the subtle change in the observer's posture, a slight straightening that suggested increased interest. "Water," Tex croaked from across the truck. "The kid needs water." The masked figure didn't acknowledge him, didn't break his study of Will. After what seemed an eternity, he retreated to the front of the truck, whispering something to the driver. "What the hell happened?" Mouse whispered, his voice cracking. "Is everyone else, are they..." "Quiet," Will murmured, his tone gentle but firm. "Save your strength." "For what?" One of the other privates, Johnson, Will recalled, asked bitterly. "They're gonna kill us anyway. If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead," Tex replied. "They took prisoners for a reason." Will knew Tex was right. Prisoners meant interrogation, leverage, propaganda. None of which improved their odds, but it bought them time. Time was all Will needed. Time to observe, analyze, plan. The truck slowed, and Will caught glimpses of a camp through gaps in the canvas covering. Bamboo structures, some permanent, others makeshift. Guards patrolling a perimeter. He counted 12 before the view was obscured again. Not a major base, but not a temporary outpost either. The vehicle stopped, and the canvas was thrown back, flooding the space with harsh sunlight. "Out!" ordered a voice in accented English. Will was dragged from the truck, stumbling as his injured leg threatened to buckle. Strong hands caught him, Tex, who'd somehow managed to position himself nearby. Their eyes met briefly, and Will gave an almost imperceptible nod of thanks. They were lined up in the center of the camp, surrounded by armed guards. Will's gaze swept over the compound, absorbing every detail. 2 watchtowers, a central structure that appeared to be command headquarters. Smaller huts for barracks. A separate area that might be an infirmary. Approximately 20 guards visible, though likely more in rotation. The perimeter was secured with bamboo fencing and what looked like mines in the clearing beyond. A man emerged from the central structure, tall for a Vietnamese, with an austere face that spoke of intelligence and education rather than battlefield brutality. He wore a simple uniform without insignia, but the deference of the others marked him as the commander. "I am Lieutenant Bao Truong," he announced, his English crisp and formal. "You are now guests of the People's Liberation Army." He paced slowly before the line of prisoners, studying each face. "Your situation is precarious. You exist outside the normal protections of war. No one knows you are here. No one will come for you." He stopped before Boone, who had regained consciousness but stood swaying, held upright by 2 guards. "You are the commanding officer?" Bao asked. Boone raised his chin defiantly. "Staff Sergeant Boone Keller. Serial number, please." Bao cut him off with a dismissive wave. "We have moved beyond such formalities. Your government abandoned you the moment you entered this jungle." His gaze traveled down the line, pausing briefly on Will. "War," Bao continued, "is merely the physical manifestation of opposing ideas. And ideas, gentlemen, cannot be killed with bullets." He smiled thinly. "Your presence here is an opportunity for education, for both sides." Mouse made a small, choked sound. Will tensed, wanting to reassure the boy, but knowing any special attention could be dangerous. He kept his expression neutral, forcing himself to appear as shell-shocked as the others. "You will be provided basic necessities," Bao said. "Compliance will be rewarded. Resistance..." His smile disappeared. "Resistance is futile, but educational. I leave the choice to you." He nodded to the guards, who began shoving prisoners toward a bamboo structure at the edge of the camp. As they stumbled forward, Will caught sight of the masked figure again. "The Crow," he heard one guard whisper to another. The masked man stood perfectly still, his gaze following Will with unsettling intensity. Will looked away quickly. He knew the type. Watchers. Hunters. In the Blackbird program, they'd trained him to be one. To disappear in plain sight. To read others while revealing nothing of himself. Now he needed to reverse everything he'd learned. To become invisible, not through skill but through mediocrity. To be forgotten among the other prisoners. Just another broken soldier. Nothing special, nothing worth watching. The bamboo prison was little more than a raised platform with a thatched roof, open on all sides to allow constant observation. The guards forced them to kneel in a line, securing their bound hands to bamboo poles driven into the ground. "What do we do, Sarge?" Mouse whispered, his voice almost inaudible. Will kept his eyes down. "We survive," he murmured. "1 hour at a time." "They took Reynolds and Miller somewhere else," Tex reported quietly. "The wounded." Will nodded slightly. "Divide and isolate, standard procedure." He'd seen it before, been trained to implement it himself. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. Tex shifted closer. "You're too calm," he observed, his voice barely a breath. "Something's not right with you, Mercer." Will gave no indication he'd heard, but inwardly he cursed his mistake. Tex was sharper than he appeared. Will would need to be more careful, show the right amount of fear, the expected level of desperation. As night fell, the guards changed shift. A woman appeared, moving among the prisoners with a bucket of water and crude wooden cups. She was slender, with delicate features hardened by determination. She wore the simple black clothing of the Viet Cong, but moved with the precision of someone with medical training. "Drink," she instructed each man in turn. When she reached Will, their eyes met briefly. Hers were dark and unreadable, assessing him with clinical detachment. She held his gaze a moment longer than necessary before moving on. Later, as insects chirred in the darkness and distant fires cast long shadows across the camp, Will began the mental work his Blackbird training had drilled into him. He visualized the compound from above, mapping escape routes, guard positions, weapons caches. He calculated timing between patrols, estimated distances to cover, factored in the wounded who couldn't be left behind. It would take time, patience, perfect timing. A movement caught his peripheral vision. The woman, the medic, stood at the edge of the prison area, clipboard in hand, apparently taking inventory. But her eyes were on him again, watching with that same unsettling intensity, as if she could see through the careful mask he'd constructed, as if she knew. Will forced himself to look away, but he could still feel her gaze burning into him. He'd been in country long enough to know that women in the Viet Cong weren't just nurses or support staff. They were fighters, strategists, interrogators, and this one had marked him somehow. Will closed his eyes, feigning exhaustion. Behind his eyelids, the mission parameters formed with crystal clarity. Objective: escape with maximum survivors. Timeline unknown, resources minimal. One thing was certain. He couldn't be Sergeant Will Mercer, former Blackbird operative, not if he wanted to keep his men alive. That man knew too much, was too dangerous to be kept alive if discovered. No, from this moment on, he was just another grunt. Scared, desperate, ordinary. The hunt had begun, and for the first time in years, Will Mercer was the prey. The monsoon rain hammered the thatched roof, water streaming through countless tiny gaps to drip on the prisoners below. Will had stopped noticing the constant moisture days ago. 7 days in captivity had established new baselines for discomfort. 7 days of careful observation. Will shifted against the bamboo pole, easing pressure on his injured leg. The wound had begun to heal thanks to Mylin's rudimentary medical care, just enough to prevent infection, not enough to restore strength. Whether this was mercy or calculation, Will couldn't yet determine. Across from him, Mouse slept fitfully, his young face twitching with nightmares. The boy had stopped crying after the 3rd day, which worried Will more than the tears had. Besides, him. Tex maintained his vigil, eyes constantly moving, cataloging. The Texan hadn't confronted Will again about his unnatural calm, but the question lingered in his watchful gaze. The rain tapered to a drizzle, and Will heard the familiar sound of boots squelching through mud. Morning inspection, right on schedule. "Look alive," Will murmured. The remaining men straightened as much as their restraints would allow. Lieutenant Bao appeared beneath an umbrella held by a young soldier. He surveyed the prisoners with clinical interest, like a scientist monitoring lab specimens. Behind him walked the Crow, silent as always, water beading on his black mask. "Good morning, gentlemen," Bao said pleasantly. "I trust you slept well." No one responded. They'd learned that Bao's pleasantries were merely openings to psychological games. "I have been reviewing your personal effects," Bao continued, pacing slowly. "Fascinating items. Private Johnson's letters from his sweetheart. Corporal Danner's rather worn photograph of his family ranch." He paused before Mouse. "Private Rivera's Medal of St. Christopher. Very touching. Your mother's inscription." Mouse flinched but remained silent. "And you, Sergeant Mercer," Bao said, stopping before Will. "Nothing sentimental at all, no letters, no photographs." He cocked his head. "A man without attachments is either very fortunate or profoundly empty." Will met his gaze evenly, offering nothing. Bao smiled thinly. "Perhaps both." He gestured to one of the guards. "Today we begin our more formal discussions. Staff Sergeant Keller, if you would join me." Boone, who had been recovering in what passed for an infirmary, was escorted into view. His wounded shoulder was bandaged, his face gaunt but defiant. The guards guided him toward the central structure. "The rest of you will contribute to camp maintenance," Bao announced. "Cooperation improves your conditions. Resistance..." He shrugged elegantly. "Let us say it creates educational opportunities." As Bao departed, the crow remained, his dark eyes moving methodically from prisoner to prisoner. They lingered on Will for several uncomfortable seconds before he too turned away. "What happens in formal discussions?" Mouse whispered, once the guards had moved to release them from the poles. "Nothing good," Tex muttered. Will kept his expression neutral. "Boone knows the protocol. Name, rank, serial number. That ain't gonna satisfy them for long," Johnson said, his voice hollow. Will didn't respond. Johnson was right, but there was no point stating the obvious. The guards assigned them tasks: clearing debris, repairing storm damage, digging drainage, ditches. Will was placed on a team hauling waste from the latrine area to a disposal pit beyond the eastern perimeter. Perfect. The task was deliberately humiliating, but Will recognized the opportunity immediately. The eastern section had the fewest guards, obscured from the main camp by dense vegetation. As he worked, he mentally mapped distances, cataloged blind spots in the patrol patterns. The rain had softened the ground, revealing the outline of what might be landmines. Old ones possibly from an earlier conflict, their positions marked by subtle changes in vegetation. By midday, Will had identified 3 potential weaknesses in the camp's security. None were immediately actionable, but knowledge accumulated. Patience was a weapon few appreciated. As the prisoners gathered for their meager midday meal, rice and some unidentifiable vegetable matter, Boone was returned to the group. He moved stiffly, favoring his right side, but showed no obvious signs of torture. His eyes, however, held a new wariness. "What happened?" Tex asked quietly as they huddled together, guarding their portions from the persistent rain. Boone glanced toward the guards before answering. Mostly questions, troop movements, base locations. He scooped rice mechanically into his mouth. "I gave them nothing they can use." Will studied him. The absence of physical abuse was telling. Bao was too shrewd for such crude methods. The interrogation had been psychological, designed to establish dominance rather than extract immediate intelligence. "We can't just sit here," Boone continued, his voice hardening. "We need to act while we still have strength." "Act how?" Johnson demanded. "We're surrounded, outnumbered, and half-starved." "Better to die trying than rot here," Boone said. Will kept eating, saying nothing. "What about you, Mercer?" Boone challenged, noticing his silence. "You've barely said 2 words since we got here." Will met his gaze. "I'm assessing the situation." "Assessing?" Boone scoffed. "While you're assessing, they're breaking us down. You've been too damn quiet. Almost like you knew this was coming." The accusation hung in the humid air. "That's out of line," Tex said, surprising everyone with his defense of Will. "Is it?" Boone leaned closer to Will. "Your patrol route changed at the last minute. Your decision led us right into that ambush." Will kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he acknowledged the irony. Boone wasn't entirely wrong. Will had adjusted their route based on subtle signs of enemy movement. What he couldn't have known was how perfectly the trap had been laid, how completely they'd been outmaneuvered. Intel was faulty, Will said simply. "I made a judgment call." "A call that got half our men killed," Boone hissed. Before Will could respond, the bamboo gate opened and Mai Lin entered, carrying a basket of medical supplies. Her face remained impassive as she moved among them, checking wounds, administering crude treatments. When she reached Will, she knelt beside him, examining his leg with clinical efficiency. Her touch was precise, professional, betraying nothing of what might lie beneath her composed exterior. "Infection is gone," she said in her accented English. "Keep clean." As she rewrapped the wound, her fingers brushed against his ankle, slipping, something beneath the edge of his boot. The movement was so subtle Will almost missed it. He gave no indication he'd noticed, maintaining the same passive expression as she moved on to check Mouse's healing head wound. Across the enclosure, the crow watched from the shadows of a banyan tree. Will felt the observer's gaze like a physical touch, probing for weakness, for secrets. The afternoon brought more labor, harder now as Bao's men drove them to exhaustion. Will continued his mental mapping, adding details with each new task. The western fence had been recently reinforced. The northern section housed the guards' quarters. The southern approach was too exposed. East. It would have to be east through the latrine area despite the potential minefield. As dusk approached, thunderclouds built again on the horizon. The prisoners were secured for the night, hands bound, to the bamboo poles but with enough slack to lie down. A small concession that felt like luxury after the first few days of kneeling. "This is insanity," Boone muttered as darkness fell. "We need to overpower the guards during transport to the work areas. 4 of us could take them if we coordinate." "And then what?" Will asked quietly. "We're miles from any friendly forces, in hostile territory with wounded men." "Better than waiting to die here," Boone insisted. "Not if it gets everyone killed," Will countered, allowing a hint of steel to enter his voice. Boone stared at him. "Since when did you become so cautious, Mercer? You were always the one pushing the envelope in training." Will cursed inwardly. Boone was right again. The Will Mercer who'd arrived in Vietnam played the role of an aggressive, by-the-book sergeant. That cover identity now worked against him. "Since half our unit died," he replied. "I'm not losing anyone else to rushed decisions." Boone's eyes narrowed. "You've changed, Mercer." Before Will could respond, the night patrol passed by, forcing them into silence. When the guards moved on, Boone had turned away, his back rigid with hostility. Will waited until the camp settled into its nighttime routine, guards at reduced alertness, prisoners feigning sleep. Only then did he carefully extract the object Mylene had slipped him. A folded leaf, wrapped around something thin and flat. He worked it open with excruciating slowness, shielding the motion with his body. Inside was a piece of flattened bark, no larger than his thumbnail with markings etched into its surface. Not writing, at least not in any language Will recognized. Symbols, arranged in a pattern that tickled something in his memory. "What's that?" Will froze. Tex had shifted silently beside him, eyes glinting in the darkness. "Nothing," Will murmured, closing his fist around the bark. "Bullshit," Tex whispered. "The nurse gave you something." Will weighed his options. Tex was too observant to fool with denials, and potentially too valuable to keep in the dark entirely. "I don't know what it is," Will admitted quietly. "Some kind of message, maybe." "From the VC nurse?" Tex's voice held disbelief. "Why would she help you?" "I don't know that she is," Will replied honestly. "Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Tex studied him for a long moment. "There's more to you than you let on, isn't there, Mercer?" Will met his gaze steadily. "There's more to everyone." Across the enclosure, Mouse whimpered in his sleep, a sound so vulnerable it momentarily distracted both men. "Kid's not gonna last much longer," Tex observed grimly. "None of us will if we stay here." Will nodded slightly. "I know. So you do have a plan?" It wasn't a question. Will hesitated, then inclined his head fractionally. Neither confirmation nor denial, but enough to satisfy Tex for the moment. "I've got your back," Tex said simply. "Whatever you're plotting, count me in." The sincerity in the man's voice caught Will off guard. It had been a long time since he'd truly trusted anyone, or been trusted in return. The Blackbird program had burned that capacity out of him, replacing it with calculation and contingency plans. "Get some rest," Will said, finally. "Tomorrow will be worse than today." Tex retreated to his spot, leaving Will alone with the mysterious bark fragment. He studied it in the faint moonlight filtering through the thatched roof. The markings formed a pattern, lines and dots arranged in what might be a map, an abstract, one. But Will recognized the technique. The Montagnard tribes use similar methods to mark hidden paths through the jungle. During his covert training, he'd learned to read some of their symbols. This wasn't a Montagnard map, but the principle was similar. Will traced the pattern with his fingertip, feeling the indentations. A route, direction markers, warning symbols. What had Bao said? A man without attachments is either very fortunate or profoundly empty. Will closed his fist around the bark fragment. Bao hadn't been entirely wrong. The Blackbird program had systematically stripped away Will's attachments, reshaping him into something efficient but hollow. Those methods had seemed necessary, even righteous, until Will had seen their consequences firsthand in his last mission. The memory still burned like acid. The village that wasn't supposed to be there. The collateral damage that had faces, names, children. He'd volunteered for regular infantry duty seeking atonement, or perhaps punishment. Instead, he'd found Mouse, Tex, and the others, men who depended on him, trusted him, men he would not abandon. The rain began again, heavier now, drumming on the thatch. Will carefully tucked the bark fragment into a small tear he'd made in his boot lining. Whatever game My Lin was playing, he would need to proceed with extreme caution. Across the compound, a light burned in Bao's quarters. Will could imagine the lieutenant there, perhaps reading or writing in a journal, approaching his prisoners as intellectual puzzles to be solved. In another life, under different circumstances, they might have recognized each other as kindred spirits, men who fought with their minds first, violence a distant second choice. The thought was disturbing. From his vantage point, Will could just make out the silhouette of the crow, standing motionless in the rain, face turned toward the prisoner enclosure. Watching, always watching. Will closed his eyes, feigning sleep while his mind continued to work. The bark fragment, the eastern perimeter, the patrol schedules, My Lin's inscrutable motives, pieces on a chessboard waiting to be moved with precision and purpose. Patience, he reminded himself. Patience and preparation. But as thunder rolled across the jungle and Mouse's whimpers grew more frantic in the darkness, Will wondered how much time they truly had before one of them broke, before Boone's desperation drove him to rash action, before the crow saw through Will's carefully constructed facade. The game had begun, silent and deadly, and Will knew the stakes all too well. There would be no second chances, no honorable surrender, only survival or death with the lives of his men hanging in the balance. He would not fail them, could not fail them, not again. The morning sun had barely pierced the jungle canopy when two guards entered the prisoner enclosure. Will, already, awake for hours, watched them scan the huddled forms of the captives before pointing directly at Mouse. "You, come," one of them ordered, prodding the young private with the butt of his rifle. Mouse jerked awake, eyes wide with confusion that quickly transformed into terror. "Sarge," he pleaded, looking to Will. Will maintained his composure with effort. "It's all right, Mouse, just answer their questions, name, rank, serial number." The guards roughly hauled Mouse to his feet. The boy's legs wobbled beneath him. Whether from fear or malnutrition, Will couldn't tell. Probably both. "Remember your training," Will said quietly as they led Mouse away. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. What training could prepare an 18-year-old for what was coming? "They're going to break him," Johnson muttered once the guards were out of earshot. "Kid doesn't know anything worth breaking him for," Tex replied, but his expression betrayed his concern. Will said nothing, his mind racing through scenarios. Mouse was the youngest, most vulnerable member of their unit. Bao would see that immediately. The question was whether the lieutenant wanted information or leverage. Boone shifted against his restraints, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. "This is why we need to move," he hissed. "They're picking us off one by one." "Mouse will hold up," Will said with more confidence than he felt. "Like you're holding up, Mercer?" Boone's eyes narrowed. Cool as ice while they dragged the kid away, Will met his gaze evenly. "Panicking won't help him. And what, Will? Boone challenged. Your endless assessment of the situation? Enough, Tex interjected. Bickering just makes their job easier. The sound of approaching footsteps silenced them. Mylene appeared with her medical basket, accompanied by a guard who kept a watchful distance. She moved among the prisoners with practiced efficiency, checking wounds, distributing small portions of medicine. When she reached Will, he seized his opportunity. I need to speak with you, he murmured, barely moving his lips. Mylene's expression remained impassive as she examined his leg wound. Quiet, she replied, her voice equally soft. The message, Will began. Her fingers pressed against his injury with sudden, deliberate pressure. Pain shot up his leg and he bit back a gasp. Not here, she whispered, bandaging his wound with swift movements. Unsafe. Before Will could respond, she moved on to Boone, leaving him with the lingering pain and the certainty that she'd understood him. That was something, at least. The bark fragment was more than random chance. The morning dragged into afternoon with no sign of Mouse. Will was assigned to drainage duty again, which gave him another opportunity to assess the eastern perimeter. The rain had revealed more of the suspected minefield's outline, confirming his initial assessment. Too dangerous for a direct escape route, but perhaps useful as a diversion. As he worked, Will found himself under the unwavering gaze of the crow. The masked observer stood at the edge of the jungle, so still he might have been part of the landscape, if not for those penetrating eyes. Will deliberately worked slower, stumbling occasionally, projecting weakness and exhaustion. All the while, his mind continued mapping, calculating. When they returned to the enclosure for the midday meal, Mouse still hadn't reappeared. The atmosphere among the prisoners grew increasingly tense. They've been at him for hours, Johnson said, pushing his meager rice portion around his bowl. He's just a kid, another Private Sullivan added. What could they possibly want? From him? Will knew the answer but kept it to himself. Mouse wasn't valuable for what he knew, but for how breaking him would affect the others. Bao was playing a longer game. As if summoned by the thought, Bao appeared at the enclosure entrance, hands clasped behind his back. Behind him came two guards, half carrying, half dragging Mouse between them. The boy's face was ashen, his eyes vacant. No visible bruises, no blood, but the hollowness of his expression spoke volumes. Private Rivera has been most cooperative, Bao announced, though perhaps not in the way he intended. Will fought to keep his expression neutral as the guards deposited Mouse beside him. The boy was trembling uncontrollably, small sounds escaping his throat that weren't quite words. What did you do to him? Tex demanded, anger overriding caution. Bao smiled thinly. We merely had a conversation about his family. His mother in particular, Maria, I believe, working 2 jobs in East Los Angeles. And his sisters. Fascinating how much homesickness can reveal. Mouse curled into himself, a keening sound rising from his chest. You son of a bitch, Boone growled. Language, Staff Sergeant, Bao admonished. I've simply helped the young man understand his situation more clearly. The fragility of connections, the illusion of safety. His gaze swept over the prisoners. A lesson you would all do well to absorb. As Bao departed, Will leaned closer to Mouse. Breathe, Rivera, he murmured. In through your nose, out through your mouth. The boy's eyes found his, desperate for anchor. He knows where they live, Sarge, he whispered. He described our apartment, building, the broken step on the 3rd floor, the yellow curtains my mom made. His voice cracked. He said they have people everywhere, that they could reach my family anytime. Will knew this tactic well. Create an impossible threat. Exploit the emotional response. Break down resistance without laying a hand on the prisoner. Crueler than physical torture in many ways. He's manipulating you, Will said firmly, playing on your fears. But what if your family is safe? Will insisted, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. Focus on staying alive. Right here, right now. Mouse nodded jerkily, but the vacancy in his eyes remained. Something fundamental had broken inside him. A belief in the order of things, perhaps, or the childish notion that there were rules even in war. Will fought down a surge of rage. Not now. Anger would only cloud his judgment, and he needed perfect clarity. After the meal, as they were being escorted back to labor details, Will stumbled deliberately, falling to his knees and clutching his stomach. He retched violently, bringing up the little food he'd consumed. "Get up," a guard ordered, prodding him with a rifle. Will retched again, more convincingly this time. Years of Blackbird training had given him control over autonomous responses most people couldn't regulate. He could raise his heart rate, induce sweating, even trigger nausea when necessary. "He's sick," Tech said, kneeling beside him with convincing concern. The guard looked uncertain, then gestured to another. They conversed briefly in Vietnamese before one departed, presumably to get instructions. Will continued the performance, shivering and gagging as sweat beaded on his forehead. He sensed rather than saw the crow watching from the perimeter, that unnerving stillness radiating suspicion. After several minutes, the guard returned with Mai Lin. She knelt beside Will, checking his pulse and temperature with clinical detachment. "Fever," she announced. "Possible malaria. He must come to infirmary." The guards exchanged glances, then nodded reluctantly. They hauled Will to his feet, supporting him as he sagged convincingly between them. As they led him away, he caught Tex's eye. The Texan gave an almost imperceptible nod. He would watch over Mouse. The infirmary was a small bamboo structure near the center of the camp, better constructed than the prisoner enclosure, but still rudimentary. Inside, 2 pallets held wounded Vietnamese soldiers. Will was deposited, on a third in the corner. Mai Lin directed the guards to secure his ankle to the pallet with a length of rope, long enough to allow movement but too short for escape. Once they departed, she busied herself preparing a basin of water and cloths. When they were alone, except for the unconscious patients, she approached Will and spoke quietly, in surprisingly good English. "You risk much with this deception." Will didn't bother denying it. "I needed to speak with you." She placed a cool cloth on his forehead, her movements professional, but her eyes watchful. "The one called Crow suspects you already." "What does he suspect?" "That you are not what you seem." She wrung out another cloth. "He never speaks, but his reports go directly to Bao." Will absorbed this. "And you? What do you suspect?" Mai Lin's expression remained carefully neutral. "That you are dangerous." She paused. "Perhaps to both sides." "The map you gave me," Will said, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "Tunnels?" She hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "An old network, from the war with the French, not used now, too unstable." "But they lead beyond the camp?" "Some collapse," she warned. "Others, worse." "Worse how?" Mai Lin's eyes darted toward the entrance. "Traps, from long ago, and things that should stay buried." Will studied her face, trying to penetrate the careful mask she wore. "Why are you helping me?" Something flickered in her eyes. Pain, perhaps, or anger. "Who says I am helping you? Perhaps I lead you to your death." "I don't believe that." "Then you are a fool." She turned away, arranging medical supplies with unnecessary precision. Will waited, sensing there was more she wanted to say. The Blackbird program had taught him to read micro-expressions, the tiny tells that betrayed a person's true thoughts. Mai Lin was disciplined, but not immune. "This war has taken enough," she said finally, her back still turned. From both sides. There it was, the thread of truth. "You've lost someone," Will guessed. She stiffened slightly. "Everyone has lost someone." After a pause, she added, "My brother, my father, my fiancé. This conflict does not discriminate in its hunger." Will understood then. Mai Lin wasn't an ideologue but a survivor, someone who had seen too much death and found herself trapped between loyalties. "Where is the entrance?" he asked. She turned back to him, her composure restored. Beneath the eastern latrine, a trapdoor, hidden by mud and waste, deliberately disgusting to discourage discovery. Will nodded. It made sense. And beyond that? A network. Some paths lead to the old French bunkers, others to the river 4 kilometers east. She leaned closer, voice dropping even further. But you would never make it. The jungle is patrolled. The tunnels are death traps. And your wounded would slow you. "We can't stay here," Will said simply. Mai Lin looked at him for a long moment. "No, you cannot." She moved away, returning to her duties. "Rest now. I will tell them the fever is breaking, that you can return tomorrow." Will closed his eyes, processing what he'd learned. The tunnels were real but dangerous. A possible escape route, but fraught with potentially lethal complications. And Mai Lin herself remained an enigma, helping, but with undefined limits and motivations he couldn't fully trust. He must have actually dozed off, because when he opened his eyes again, the light had changed. Late afternoon. He'd been in the infirmary for hours, and he wasn't alone. The crow stood at the foot of his pallet, unmoving, those dark eyes fixed on Will with uncomfortable intensity. How long had he been watching? What had he seen? Will shifted, allowing confusion to show on his face. "Where?" he mumbled, as if disoriented. The crow made no response, not even a change in his breathing. His stillness was unnerving, inhuman almost. Will had encountered men like this before, during his specialized training. Men who'd been emptied out and refilled with something else, something focused to a singular purpose. Mai Lin entered, faltering slightly when she saw the crow. She recovered quickly, checking Will's forehead with clinical efficiency. "Fever down," she announced. "He can return." The crow inclined his head fractionally, then gestured toward the door. Will stood carefully, maintaining the pretense of weakness as he was escorted back to the prisoner enclosure. The crow walked 3 paces behind him, never speaking, never shifting his gaze. When they reached the bamboo structure, the other prisoners looked up with varying expressions of relief and curiosity. Mouse sat huddled against a post, his vacant stare fixed on nothing. Tex nodded slightly to Will, a silent communication that nothing had changed. Boone, however, was watching Will with open suspicion. The crow departed after securing Will to his usual post, but the weight of his scrutiny lingered like a physical presence. "What happened?" Tex asked quietly once the guards had moved away. "Stomach bug," Will replied, loud enough for the others to hear. Then much softer, "I need to talk to you. Later." Tex gave a slight nod. As dusk approached, the prisoners received their evening meal, rice again, but with a small portion of some unidentifiable meat. Better than usual, which immediately raised Will's suspicions. Changes in routine often preceded heightened interrogation. Sure enough, as they finished eating, Bao appeared with 4 guards. "Gentlemen," he greeted them, "I hope you've found today's accommodation satisfactory." No one responded. "I've been reviewing the results of our conversations," Bao continued, pacing slowly before them. "Private Rivera provided some interesting insights about unit morale. Staff Sergeant Keller shared his concerns about leadership, his gaze fixed on Will, and Sergeant Mercer remains enigmatic." Will kept his expression neutral, though internally he was calculating the implications. Bao was deliberately sowing discord, highlighting perceived fractures among the prisoners. "Tomorrow," Bao announced, "we begin a new phase of our discussions, more focused." The threat hung in the air as he departed, leaving the prisoners to contemplate its meaning in the gathering darkness. Once the camp settled into its nighttime routine, Tex shifted closer to Will. "What did you find out?" he whispered. Will hesitated. How much should he reveal? Tex had proven himself trustworthy, but knowledge was a double-edged sword. If captured and interrogated, what Tex didn't know couldn't be extracted. But Will also recognized the reality of their situation. He couldn't execute an escape alone, especially with wounded men. He needed allies. "There's a tunnel network," Will murmured, his voice barely audible. "Eastern side, beneath the latrine area." Tex's eyes widened slightly, but he controlled his reaction. "You sure?" Mylin confirmed it. "The nurse?" Tex's skepticism was evident. "Why would she help?" "She's lost people," Will said simply. "Doesn't see the point of more death." Tex absorbed this. "So we've got a way out." "A potential way," Will corrected. "She says the tunnels are unstable, booby-trapped, leftovers from the French occupation. Still better odds than staying here for Bow's-focused discussions." Will couldn't argue with that. "We'd need a diversion to access the entrance, and we'd need to move all at once, no going back for stragglers." Tex nodded slowly. "When?" "I need to confirm the entrance first. Tomorrow, if I can get on latrine duty again." "Boone's planning something," Tex warned. "He's been whispering to Sullivan and Johnson, trying to get me on board too." Will had suspected as much. Boone's frustration and panic were pushing him toward action, regardless of the consequences. "We can't have competing escape attempts," Will said. "It would compromise everything." "Try telling him that." Tex glanced toward where Boone sat, his back rigid with tension even in the darkness. "He thinks you've gone soft. Or worse." "What do you think?" Will asked, genuinely curious. Tex studied him for a long moment. "I think there's more to you than a regular sergeant. Some kind of special training, maybe." "Intelligence?" Will neither confirmed nor denied it, which was answer enough. "Doesn't matter," Tex continued. "What matters is, you've kept a cool head, while everyone else is losing theirs. That's good enough for me." The simple statement of trust affected Will more than he expected. In the Blackbird program, trust was considered a liability, a weakness to be exploited rather than a strength to be nurtured. "Keep an eye on Boone," Will instructed. "Delay him if you can, but don't put yourself at risk." Tex nodded. "What? About Mouse?" They both glanced toward the young private who had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, his face twitching with nightmares. "He'll recover," Will said, hoping it was true. "Once we're out of here." "And if he doesn't?" Will had no answer for that. The Blackbird program had taught protocols for compromised assets, but he'd abandoned those protocols the moment he'd seen Mouse's broken expression. Whatever happened, he wouldn't leave the boy behind. The night deepened around them, bringing with it the jungle's symphony of insects and distant animal calls. Will found himself thinking of the tunnels beneath them. Dark, confined spaces hiding who knew what dangers. The perfect metaphor for this entire situation. Above, through gaps in the thatched roof, stars were occasionally visible between drifting clouds. Will oriented himself by them, confirming his mental map of the camp and surrounding area. East to the river, then south toward the nearest American fire base, if it still existed. The risks were enormous, the variables too numerous to fully calculate. And yet, what choice did they have? From across the enclosure, Will felt Boone's eyes on him, watchful and resentful. Another variable, potentially the most dangerous. Leader who felt undermined might take desperate action. And somewhere out in the darkness, the crow kept his silent vigil, seeing more than he should, speaking less than he knew. Will closed his eyes, mapping the camp once more in his mind. Tomorrow, he would confirm the tunnel entrance. Then the real work would begin, preparing the men, creating a diversion, timing their movement with the guard rotations. A deadly puzzle with pieces constantly in motion. But Will had solved such puzzles before. He would solve this one too, or die in the attempt. Either way, their time was running out. Will woke to shouting. His eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness, instincts immediately alert. Guards were converging on the far side of the camp, flashlight beams cutting through the mist. A whistle shrilled, the alarm signal he'd noted during his observations. "What the hell?" Tex murmured beside him, jerking awake. Will scanned the prisoner enclosure. Empty spaces where 3 men should have been. Boone, he said grimly. Sullivan, Johnson. Tex swore under his breath. They went for it. Tonight? Before Will could respond, gunfire erupted from the jungle's edge. 3 short bursts followed by a scattering of single shots. Then silence, more ominous than the chaos preceding it. Will's stomach tightened. Boone had acted without warning, without coordination. The choice would likely cost all of them dearly. Mouse stirred, his young face creased with confusion and fear. What's happening? Stay quiet, Will ordered, his voice low but firm. Don't draw attention. More guards rushed past the enclosure, heading toward the commotion. Will watched them, counting. 8, 10, 12. Almost the entire security detail focused on the eastern perimeter, exactly where Boone must have tried to break through. Beside him, Tex tensed. They're coming back. 2 guards appeared, dragging a figure between them. Even in the dim light, Will recognized Sullivan's lanky frame. The private's face was a mask of blood, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Behind them came 4 more guards escorting a second prisoner. Boone walked under his own power, but his head hung in defeat, hands bound behind his back. No sign of Johnson. The guards threw Sullivan onto the ground in the center of the camp. He lay motionless, groaning softly. Boone was forced to kneel. Beside him, a rifle pressed to the back of his head. The camp commander emerged from his quarters, hastily dressed but fully alert. Bao surveyed the scene, his expression cold as he spoke quietly to one of the guards. The man nodded and hurried away. What happened to Johnson? Mouse whispered, his voice trembling. Will didn't answer. He didn't need to. The absence of the third escapee told its own story. The eastern sky had begun to lighten when Bao finally approached the prisoner enclosure. Gone was the philosophical demeanor, the veneer of civility. His face was tight with controlled rage. An educational moment, he announced, courtesy of your comrades. At his gesture, guards entered the enclosure, roughly awakening any prisoners still asleep and dragging everyone out to form a line facing where Sullivan lay. Observe, Bao said, his voice carrying in the still morning air. The consequences of misplaced courage. Sullivan's eyes fluttered, consciousness returning with pain. He whimpered, trying to curl into himself, but a guard's boot pressed into his broken leg, pinning him flat. His scream cut through the fog. Staff Sergeant Keller believed he could outmaneuver us, Bao continued. He convinced these men to follow him into folly. He paced slowly before the line of prisoners. Private Johnson paid with his life, shot, while attempting to breach our perimeter. Will kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he was calculating the ramifications. Boone's failed escape would mean tightened security, increased scrutiny, possibly relocating the prisoners. Everything he'd carefully mapped and planned now rendered useless. Private Sullivan requires medical attention, Bao observed dispassionately. Whether he receives it depends on what we learn from this incident. He stopped directly in front of Will, studying him with new intensity. You were not part of this ill-conceived venture, Sergeant Mercer. Curious, given Staff Sergeant Keller's seniority, one might expect you to follow his lead. Will met his gaze evenly. I follow orders, sir, not suicide missions. Indeed. Bao's eyes narrowed slightly, and yet I wonder if there isn't another explanation. Perhaps you recognize the plan's flaws because you have experience in such matters. The question hung in the air between them. Will kept his face impassive, but he knew Bao had begun to connect the dots. The lieutenant wasn't merely suspicious anymore, he was probing for confirmation. Or perhaps, Bao continued when Will remained silent, you had your own design in mind? Something more sophisticated? Will allowed a flicker of confusion to cross his face. I don't understand, sir. Don't you? Bao smiled thinly. Join me for tea, Sergeant. We have much to discuss. He turned to the guards. Take Staff Sergeant Keller to the interrogation hut. Ensure he's secured. Private Sullivan. He paused, studying the wounded man critically. Leave him where the others can see him. A reminder of consequences. Will was led away by 2 guards, painfully aware of the crow materializing from the shadows to follow at a discreet distance. Behind him, Sullivan's ragged breathing punctuated the unnatural quiet. Bao's quarters were Spartan but considerably more comfortable than the prisoner enclosure. A small table had been prepared with a tea service. Porcelain cups and a steaming pot that seemed absurdly civilized against the backdrop of the camp's brutality. "Sit," Bao invited, gesturing to a simple wooden chair. Will complied, measuring the distance to the door, noting the position of the guards outside. Bao poured tea with practiced movements. "My father was a professor of literature at Hanoi University," he said conversationally. "He taught me that one can learn much about a man by observing what he reads." He pushed a cup toward Will. "Do you read, Sergeant?" "When I can, sir." "And what do you prefer? Adventure stories? Technical manuals?" Bao sipped his tea. "Philosophy, perhaps?" Will sensed the conversation shifting into dangerous territory. "Mostly letters from home," he replied, playing to the expected profile of a simple soldier. Bao's mouth quirked. "How conventional. Yet I suspect there's nothing conventional about you." He set his cup down precisely. "Your comportment suggests training beyond standard military preparation. Your reactions, or rather your careful lack of reactions, speak to discipline unusual in a field sergeant." Will took a deliberate sip of tea, buying time. "Combat changes people, sir." "Indeed it does, though rarely with such specificity." Bao leaned forward slightly. "Your fellow prisoners display the expected range of responses to captivity: fear, anger, desperation. You, however, exhibit something altogether different: patience, calculation, a willingness to sacrifice immediate relief for long-term advantage." Will kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he cursed his mistake. He'd underestimated Bao's perceptiveness. Your American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "What you do speaks so loudly that I cannot hear what you say." Bao smiled thinly. "You say nothing, Sergeant Mercer, yet your silence is deafening." "I'm just trying to survive, sir," Will replied, allowing a hint of weariness to color his voice. "Like everyone else." "No," Bao said softly. "Not like everyone else. That's precisely my point." The door opened, and the crow entered silently, placing a folder on the table before retreating to the corner, where he stood motionless, watching. Bao opened the folder and removed a sheet of paper. "We've been reviewing our intelligence. Interesting reports about a specialized American training program, something called Blackbird." Will's blood went cold, though he maintained his carefully neutral expression. How much did they know? How much was speculation? Operatives trained in escape, evasion, and psychological warfare, Bao continued. Men who could withstand captivity, manipulate their captors, engineer breakouts from seemingly impossible situations. He tapped the paper thoughtfully. Men who would be inserted into standard units under cover identities. Will took another sip of tea to hide any reaction. "Sounds like something from a spy novel, sir." "Perhaps." Bao studied him intently. "Yet sometimes reality exceeds fiction, doesn't it, Sergeant?" The interrogation continued for nearly an hour, Bao circling around the Blackbird program without directly accusing Will of involvement. It was a masterful performance, probing for reactions, laying traps, watching for tells that might confirm his suspicions. Will gave him nothing, maintaining the persona of a conventional sergeant slightly smarter than average, but otherwise unremarkable. Yet with each exchange, he sensed Bao's conviction solidifying. The lieutenant didn't need proof. His instincts were enough. "You may return to your comrades," Bao finally said. "We'll continue our discussion another time." As Will stood, Bao added, "I suggest you contemplate Private Sullivan's condition, Sergeant. Whatever plans you might be harboring, remember that. Others will bear the consequences." The implied threat was clear. Will nodded respectfully and allowed himself to be escorted back to the prisoner enclosure, the crow following like a silent shadow. Sullivan still lay where they'd left him, his breathing now shallow and labored. Someone, probably Tex, had managed to position a scrap of cloth beneath his head, but otherwise the wounded man remained untreated. An object lesson in defiance. Jesus, Tex muttered as Will was secured to his post again. What did Bao want? To rattle me, Will replied quietly. He suspects something. About the tunnels? About me. Tex absorbed this. How bad? Bad enough? Will glanced toward Sullivan. How long has he been like that? Getting worse by the hour. Fever's setting in. Will nodded grimly. Without medical attention, Sullivan wouldn't last much longer. Infection in this environment was practically a death sentence. Any sign of Boone? Still in interrogation? Tex's expression darkened. They've been working him over pretty hard. We can hear him sometimes. Will closed his eyes briefly, calculating. Boone's failed escape attempt had accelerated everything. The relative stability of their captivity had shattered, replaced by an unpredictable new dynamic. Bao's suspicions, Sullivan's deteriorating condition, the likely tightening of security, all variables shifting too rapidly to track. We need to move, he murmured. When? Soon. Before Will could elaborate, Mai Lin appeared, medical basket in hand. Her face revealed nothing as she moved toward Sullivan, kneeling to examine him. Critical, she announced after a brief assessment. Requires surgery. Take him to infirmary, ordered the nearest guard. Mai Lin shook her head. Too late to move, I treat here. The guard hesitated, then barked something in Vietnamese to another, who hurried toward the command hut, presumably to get authorization. As Mai Lin began cleaning Sullivan's wounds, she worked her way methodically around his body. When she reached his lower legs, her back to most of the guards, her hand moved swiftly to Will's boot, slipping something inside before continuing her treatment. Will remained perfectly still, giving no indication anything had happened. The guard returned with approval, and Mai Lin proceeded to treat Sullivan with the limited supplies available. The private had lapsed into unconsciousness, which was probably a mercy given the crude surgery that followed. She extracted bone fragments, cleaned the wound thoroughly, then splinted the leg with bamboo strips and bandages torn from her own supplies. Throughout the procedure, Will waited for an opportunity to examine whatever Mai Lin had passed him. It came during the midday meal, when the prisoners were briefly unbound to eat. As he slowly consumed his rice, he managed to retrieve the item from his boot, a scrap of gauze folded tightly around something stiff. Later, in the relative privacy of the latrine area, Will carefully unfolded the gauze. Sketched in iodine was a crude but detailed map of what could only be the tunnel system. Entrance points, major junctions, and most importantly, warnings, areas marked with skull symbols presumably indicating collapse zones or traps. Will committed the map to memory, then refolded the gauze and tucked it into a tear in his boot lining. He'd just finished when a presence behind him made him tense. The crow stood 5 paces away, silent as always, watching. How long he'd been there, Will couldn't tell. Will straightened, maintaining the facade of an ordinary sergeant, attending to basic needs. The masked observer made no move to approach or to alert the guards. After a long, uncomfortable moment, he simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the underbrush like his namesake. The encounter left Will deeply unsettled. The crow could have reported him, could have searched him and discovered the map. Why hadn't he? When Will returned to the enclosure, Boone had been brought back. The staff sergeant sat slumped against his post, face battered, one eye swollen shut. His expression was vacant, defeated in a way that went beyond physical pain. They broke him, Tex murmured as Will was secured again. Whatever Bao did in there? Will studied Boone carefully. The man's posture, his disconnected gaze, all indicated severe psychological trauma rather than mere physical abuse. Bao had found the staff sergeant's breaking point and exploited it ruthlessly. Did he talk to anyone? Will asked. Tex shook his head. Hasn't said a word since they brought him back. As night fell, Sullivan's condition worsened despite Mai Lynn's treatment. The fever had taken hold, and his breathing grew increasingly labored. Mouse sat beside him, awkwardly trying to offer comfort despite his own obvious distress. "He's not going to make it, is he?" the young private asked when Will approached. Will saw no point in false reassurance. "Probably not." Mouse's face crumpled briefly before he mastered himself. "This is all so messed up, Sarge. Johnson's dead, Sullivan's dying, Boone's whatever he is now." He looked up, his young face haggard with fear and exhaustion. "What's going to happen? To us?" The raw vulnerability in the boy's voice struck something deep in Will, something the Blackbird program had tried to excise but never quite managed to eliminate. Mouse wasn't just another variable in the escape equation. He was a frightened kid looking to Will for answers, for hope. "We're getting out of here," Will said quietly, the decision crystallizing as he spoke. "All of us who still can." Mouse's eyes widened slightly. "You have a plan?" "Yes." "When?" Will glanced toward the darkening sky, calculating. "Tomorrow night, during the midnight guard change." Once the guards had completed their evening check and retreated to their posts, Will gestured Tex closer. "It's time," he murmured. "We move tomorrow night." Tex nodded, unsurprised. "Sullivan won't make it that long." "I know." The knowledge sat heavily in Will's chest. "But if we wait, we could lose more. Boone's in no shape to travel either." Will had already factored that in. "We bring him if he can move, carry him if necessary." Tex studied him. "You're really willing to risk everything for these men? Even Boone after what he did?" The question gave Will pause. In the Blackbird program, the mission always came first. Compromised assets were left behind. Clean breaks, no loose ends. But somewhere along the line, perhaps when Mouse had looked at him with absolute trust or when Tex had proven his loyalty despite his suspicions, Will had made a different choice. "Yes," he said simply. "Then I'm with you." Tex's expression was resolute. "What's the plan?" Will outlined it quickly. The tunnel entrance beneath the eastern latrine, the map Lynn had provided, the route to the river 4 kilometers away. "The midnight guard change gives us our best window," he explained. "The outgoing shift is tired, the incoming not fully alert." "We'll need a diversion," Tex pointed out. Will nodded. "I've been setting that up for days. Remember those drainage ditches we dug on the north side? The ones that kept collapsing? They collapsed because I weakened the support structure each time I worked on them. One good rain, and they'll give way completely, threatening the guard quarters." Tex looked impressed. "And if there's no rain tomorrow, then we create a different diversion." Will's expression hardened. "One way or another, we're leaving. Bao's suspicions are growing, and once he's certain about me, things will get much worse for everyone." "How many guards on the night shift?" 4 on the perimeter, 2 floating, 1 in the tower. The Crow is the wild card. He doesn't follow normal patterns." They discussed details for nearly an hour. Timing, signals, contingency plans. Throughout the conversation, Will found himself increasingly certain he was making the right choice, despite the enormous risks. "Get some rest," he finally told Tex. "Tomorrow we'll take everything we've got." As Tex moved away, Will glanced toward Boone, who hadn't shifted position since being returned to the enclosure. The staff sergeant stared blankly at nothing, trapped in whatever hell Bao had constructed for him. Steeling himself, Will shuffled closer to Boone. "Staff Sergeant," he said quietly. Boone didn't respond, didn't even blink. "Boone," Will tried, again keeping his voice low. "We're moving out tomorrow night, all of us." Still nothing. Will leaned closer. "Whatever Bao did, whatever he said, he did it because you scared him. Because your attempt, flawed as it was, showed courage." A flicker of awareness crossed Boone's battered face. "Johnson's death isn't on you," Will continued. "It's on them. Remember that." Boone's one good eye finally focused on Will. "You don't know," he whispered, his voice a raw scrape. What I told them. Will felt a chill. What did you tell them, Boone? Everything. A single tear tracked down Boone's cheek. About the unit, about our route that day, about you. Will went very still. What about me? That you changed the patrol plan, that you seemed to know what was coming. Boone's breath hitched. That I thought you might have led us into the ambush deliberately. The accusation hit Will like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because Bao would certainly use it to further his suspicions. They'll take you tonight, Boone continued, his voice hollow. Bao said to tell you that. He wants you to know it's coming. Will absorbed this, rapidly, reevaluating. If Bao planned to isolate him for special interrogation, their timetable had just collapsed from hours to minutes. Did they break Johnson's radio? He asked urgently. Boone looked confused by the apparent non sequitur. What? Johnson's emergency radio, the one he kept hidden in his boot. It was a calculated risk. There was no such radio, but Will needed to know if Boone was completely broken or still capable of secrecy. I didn't tell them about that, Boone whispered, confusion giving way to a spark of hope. You think it still works? Will had his answer. Boone had broken, but not irreparably. He still wanted to believe in the possibility of escape, of redemption. We'll find out tonight, Will said, infusing his voice with confidence he didn't entirely feel. Be ready. As he moved away, Sullivan groaned softly, his breathing growing more labored. Mouse still sat beside him, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth. The boy looked up as Will approached. He's getting worse, Sarge. Will knelt beside the dying man, checking his pulse. Weak, erratic. Sullivan wouldn't last the night, much less an escape attempt through jungle tunnels. The knowledge settled like a stone in Will's gut. Another death he couldn't prevent. Another name to add to the list that already haunted his dreams. Night deepened around the camp, bringing with it the myriad sounds of the jungle. Will sat against his post, seemingly at rest but inwardly alert, processing Boone's warning. If Bao planned to move against him specifically, the entire escape plan needed acceleration. No midnight guard change, no waiting for optimal conditions. They would have to move tonight. Will caught Tex's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Then he shifted his gaze significantly towards Sullivan, the motion just pronounced enough for Tex to notice. The Texan's eyes narrowed in understanding. The plan had changed. Death was coming, for Sullivan, and possibly for all of them if they remained. As Will settled in to wait for the deepest part of night, he found himself thinking of all the training that had led him here. The Blackbird program had prepared him for captivity, for escape, for every physical contingency. What it hadn't prepared him for was the weight of responsibility for others, not just as mission objectives, but as people he had come to care about. Mouse, with his youth and vulnerability. Tex, with his steady loyalty. Even Boone, broken but not beyond redemption. The Blackbird program would have considered such attachments liabilities. Perhaps they were right. Yet as Will watched the stars through gaps in the thatched roof, mentally reviewing the escape route one final time, he knew he wouldn't have it any other way. Tonight they would live or die together, variables that refused to fit any equation. Will rejoined the drainage detail, his sodden uniform now covered in filth that provided perfect camouflage for his real activities. Tex raised an eyebrow questioningly. Will gave a small nod. The tunnel entrance was confirmed. Tonight, he murmured as they worked side by side. After evening meal, Tex nodded almost imperceptibly. I'll tell Mouse. And Boone? Tex's expression hardened. You still want to bring him? The question had been weighing on Will since Boone's confession. The staff sergeant was a liability, broken, unpredictable, potentially dangerous. Blackbird protocols were clear on such situations. Compromised assets were abandoned. But Will had already crossed that line. Yes, he said finally. Everyone, still breathing, comes with us. They worked through the morning, the rain eventually tapering to a steady drizzle. As they were being escorted back to the enclosure for the midday meal, a commotion near the command hut caught their attention. Bao stood beneath the sheltered entrance, engaged in heated discussion with a Vietnamese officer Will hadn't seen before. The man wore the insignia of a higher rank, his demeanor imperious as he gestured emphatically toward the prisoner area. "Trouble," Tex murmured. Will agreed. The arrival of a superior officer meant changes, possibly a prisoner transfer, increased security, or accelerated interrogations, none of which improved their already slim chances of escape. They received their meager rice portions in silence. Mouse hadn't moved from his spot since Sullivan's body had been removed, his young face a mask of shock and grief. Will settled beside him, offering his own portion. "You need to eat," he said quietly. Mouse didn't respond, didn't even seem to register Will's presence. "Rivera," Will tried again, deliberately using his surname, attempting to trigger the military discipline that might reach him where compassion couldn't. "That's an order." The boy's eyes flickered briefly, a ghost of recognition. "What's the point?" he whispered. "We're all going to die here." "Not all of us," Will replied. "Not today." Something in his tone made Mouse look up, truly focus for the first time since Sullivan's death. "What do you mean?" Will held his gaze steadily. "Do you trust me?" A beat of silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, Mouse nodded. "Then eat, gather your strength, and be ready." Before Mouse could respond, the enclosure gate opened and Bao entered with the visiting officer. The lieutenant's expression was carefully neutral, but Will detected tension in the set of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. "Attention, gentlemen," Bao announced. "Colonel Nguyen has arrived to evaluate our facility." His gaze swept over the prisoners, lingering briefly on Will. "He is particularly interested in certain intelligence we've gathered." Will kept his expression blank, though inwardly he calculated the implications. If Bao's suspicions about him had reached higher command, their window for escape was closing even faster than he'd feared. Colonel Nguyen paced slowly before them, inspecting each prisoner with clinical detachment. He was older than Bao, his face weathered by years of conflict, eyes sharp with intelligence, and what Will recognized as deep-seated hatred. "You harbor a special prisoner," Nguyen commented to Bao in Vietnamese, evidently assuming none of the Americans understood. The Blackbird operative, Will betrayed no reaction, though the confirmation that they knew, or strongly suspected, his true background sent a chill through him. "Not confirmed, but likely," Bao replied in the same language. "I've been probing for verification before, beginning specialized interrogation." "Too slow," Nguyen said dismissively. "We transfer him tomorrow to sector headquarters. The Russians have specialists interested in American psychological warfare programs." Will's blood ran cold. Transfer to Russian interrogators would mean the end, not just for him but for any hope of escape for the others. "As you wish, Colonel," Bao acquiesced, though Will caught a flicker of resentment in his tone. "Which one do you believe it is?" Nguyen's gaze moved deliberately across the prisoners before settling on Will. "That one," he said with certainty. "The quiet one who watches everything." Bao nodded. "Sergeant Mercer. Yes, he is my primary suspect as well." "Prepare him for transport at dawn," Nguyen ordered. "The others remain here for now." As they departed, Will fought to maintain his neutral expression despite the urgency now thrumming through him. Dawn. Less than 18 hours remaining. Tex moved closer once the guards had resumed their positions. "What was that about?" "Bad news," Will murmured. "We move tonight no matter what." "They suspect?" "They know." Will kept his voice barely audible. "I'm being transferred tomorrow. Special interrogation." Tex's eyes widened slightly. "Russians?" Will nodded grimly. "Jesus." Tex glanced toward where Boone sat staring vacantly at nothing. Boone must have broken worse than we thought. It wasn't just Boone, Will said. I've been careless, letting my training show. The afternoon dragged with excruciating slowness. The prisoners were kept in the enclosure rather than assigned work details, possibly due to the colonel's visit, possibly in preparation for Will's transfer. The change in routine would have complicated their escape plan if Will hadn't already decided to move that night. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Bao reappeared, this time alone. He walked directly to Will. A word, Sergeant Mercer. Will was escorted to Bao's quarters again. The familiar tea service prepared as if this were a social visit, rather than what Will knew would be a final psychological assessment before his transfer. Colonel Nguyen lacks subtlety, Bao remarked, as he poured the steaming liquid. But he compensates with efficiency. Will said nothing, watching the lieutenant's movements carefully. I had hoped for more time, Bao continued. Our conversations have been intellectually stimulating. He smiled thinly. A rare commodity in this war. I'm just a sergeant, sir, Will replied, maintaining his cover despite knowing it was essentially blown. Nothing special. Please, Bao said, an edge creeping into his voice. Let us dispense with the charade. It insults us both. He sipped his tea. The colonel believes you are Blackbird. I concur. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. Will weighed his options. Continued denial would waste energy. Limited acknowledgement might open new tactical possibilities. Blackbird is a myth, he said carefully. Psychological warfare rumors spread to make you suspect every captured American of being more than he appears. Bao smiled. A clever response. Neither confirmation nor denial, while planting seeds of doubt. He set down his cup precisely. My brother was killed 4 years ago. An American raid on what they claimed was a military target. It was a medical school. The abrupt change of subject caught Will off guard. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, sincerity breaking through his calculated facade. Are you? Bao studied him with renewed intensity. I believe you might be. That's what makes you dangerous, Sergeant Mercer. Unlike most Americans, you understand us as people, not merely as enemies. Understanding doesn't change the reality of our situation, Will replied. No. Bao's expression hardened slightly. You remain my prisoner. Tomorrow you will face interrogation techniques far less civilized than our conversations. He leaned forward. Unless, of course, you choose to cooperate now. Will met his gaze steadily. You know I can't do that. Can't or won't? Bao shook his head. Your loyalty is commendable but misplaced. Your government abandoned you the moment you entered this jungle. Your comrades, he gestured vaguely toward the enclosure, cannot be saved. One is already broken, another dead, the young one soon to follow. The mention of Mouse sent a surge of protective anger through Will, which he carefully suppressed. Why are you telling me this? Because I recognize a kindred spirit, Bao replied simply. Men trained to think rather than merely fight. Chess players in a war of checkers. A shadow crossed his face. A waste of potential. Will sensed an opening, not for escape but for information. The colonel didn't seem to share your philosophical approach. Nguyen is a blunt instrument, Bao said dismissively. Effective but unimaginative. He paused. He also doesn't know everything about this camp. Such as? Bao's smile was enigmatic. Such as its history. The secrets buried beneath it. His eyes flickered with something resembling amusement. But you've discovered some of those already, haven't you? With help, perhaps. Will kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he cursed. Bao knew about the tunnels, or at least suspected their existence. Trust is a fragile thing in war, Bao continued. Consider carefully whom you rely upon. Betrayal often comes from unexpected quarters. The warning was clear, though its target remained ambiguous. Was Bao suggesting Mai Lin's assistance was a trap? Or was he trying to sow distrust among the prisoners themselves? Before Will could parse the lieutenant's meaning, the door opened and the crow entered silently. He made no sound, offered no salute, simply stood watching with those unnervingly still eyes. "Ah, my shadow returns," Bao remarked. "Have you completed your inspection?" The crow inclined his head slightly. "Good." Bao turned back to Will. "You are dismissed, Sergeant. We will complete our conversation tomorrow, though under less pleasant circumstances, I'm afraid." As Will was escorted back to the enclosure, he noted increased activity throughout the camp. Guards checking weapons, securing perimeters, preparing for something. The colonel's visit had heightened security exactly when they needed it most relaxed. When he rejoined the others, Will found Mouse sitting slightly more upright, a hint of awareness having returned to his eyes. The boy looked up as Will approached. "Sarge?" His voice was tentative, as if emerging from a long silence. "Is it true what Tex said? We're getting out?" Will nodded slightly. "Tonight." A flicker of hope crossed the young private's face, quickly replaced by fear. "How? There are guards everywhere." "Trust me," Will said simply. Mouse studied him for a long moment, then nodded. The gesture held a weight of faith that pressed on Will's conscience. He was asking these men to risk everything based on his judgment, his training, his belief that the tunnels offered a viable escape route. If he was wrong, their deaths would be on his hands. The evening brought no relief from the oppressive humidity, though the rain had finally stopped. The sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the camp. Guards lit torches at key points, creating pools of flickering light surrounded by deepening darkness. Will watched the activity carefully, noting patrol patterns, guard positions, potential blind spots. The eastern perimeter, where the latrine and tunnel entrance were located, remained less heavily guarded than other sections, a small advantage in their increasingly desperate situation. When the evening meal arrived, rice again, but with a small portion of fish, Will initiated the next phase of his plan. "Guard," he called out, his voice pitched to carry. "My watch is missing." The nearest guard approached, suspicious. "What watch?" "Military issue," Will replied. "It was in my boot." The guard frowned. "Prisoners have no valuables." "It was hidden," Will insisted. "Someone took it during work detail." The accusation sparked immediate interest from the other guards. Valuable items often disappeared in the camp, leading to accusations and counter-accusations among them. Will had observed this dynamic and was now exploiting it. "Perhaps other guard take," the first guard suggested, eyes narrowing as he glanced toward his colleagues. "Or prisoner lie," another guard countered. The exchange escalated gradually, drawing more guards into the dispute, exactly as Will had intended. Distrust planted, spreading like ripples in still water. As darkness settled fully over the camp, final preparations were made for the night. The prisoners were secured to their posts, guards positioned for the first watch. Will caught Tex's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward Mouse, then toward Boone. They were ready. The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Will forced himself to breathe evenly, to project the appearance of sleep while remaining hyper-alert. One by one, the camp sounds diminished. Voices silenced, movement stilled, the jungle's nocturnal symphony rising to fill the void. Midnight approached. The time for the guard change was coming. Their window would be brief, perhaps 2 minutes when the outgoing guards briefed their replacements. Attention diverted from the prisoners. Will had nearly worked his hands free from their loosened bindings when a figure materialized from the darkness, moving silently toward Tex. Boone, somehow already free of his restraints. "I know what you're planning," the staff sergeant whispered, his voice barely audible. "I want in." Tex hesitated, looking toward Will. The unspoken question hung between them. Will studied Boone's face in the dim moonlight. The vacant shock had receded, replaced by a desperate determination, a man seeking redemption or perhaps just survival. Either way, a potential liability, but also another pair of hands. Another body to help carry those who might falter. Will nodded slightly. "Get Mouse," Tex murmured to Boone. "Stay quiet." Boone moved to the young private, helping him slip free of his loosened restraints. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but clearer now, focused on the immediate task rather than lost in grief. Will freed himself completely, listening intently for the guard change. It came moments later. Soft footsteps, murmured conversations, the brief illumination of a torch as the night watch rotated positions. "Now," Will breathed. They moved as one, slipping from the enclosure through a section of bamboo Will had gradually weakened over days. The darkness swallowed them as they hugged the shadows, moving in single file toward the eastern perimeter. Will led, having memorized the patrol timing and blind spots. Tex followed, then Mouse, with Boone bringing up the rear. They reached the latrine without incident, the stench providing perfect cover as Will located the trapdoor. It opened more easily this time, his earlier inspection having broken the seal of mud and time. A black void gaped beneath them, the tunnel, entrance exhaling a breath of stale, damp air. "I'll go first," Will whispered. Then Mouse, Boone, Tex. He lowered himself into the darkness, feeling for handholds on the rough earthen walls. The tunnel was narrow but navigable, descending at a shallow angle before leveling out. Will moved forward several feet, then signaled for the others to follow. One by one they descended into the earth, leaving the prison camp behind. The darkness was absolute, pressing against them like a physical weight. Will moved slowly, one hand on the wall for guidance, the other extended forward to detect obstacles. They had traveled perhaps 50 meters when a sound behind them froze Will in place. A soft scraping, too deliberate for falling soil, too rhythmic for an animal. Someone was following them. Will signaled the others to stop, straining his ears, in the darkness. The sound came again, closer now. Not an echo, not his imagination. A presence in the tunnel behind them. Will tightened his grip on the crude shiv he'd fashioned from a drainage pipe fragment. If they'd been discovered, if guards were pursuing them, their only option was to press forward to try to outpace their pursuers in the labyrinthine tunnels. The footsteps grew closer, unhurried, almost casual in their steady advance. Will pressed the others onward with urgent whispers, quickening their pace despite the risks of unseen obstacles. The tunnel branched, then branched again. He followed, the mental map from Mai Lin's iodine sketch, taking the route she had indicated would lead toward the river. Still the footsteps followed, never gaining but never falling behind. A single pursuer moving with the confidence of someone who knew these tunnels intimately. They had traveled perhaps a kilometer when the tunnel suddenly widened into a small chamber. Ancient support beams, rotted but still holding, created a space where they could stand upright. Multiple passages branched from this central point, like spokes from a wheel. Will pulled the others into the chamber, positioning himself to face the tunnel they'd just traversed. Whoever was following would emerge there. "Sarge, what's happening?" Mouse whispered, his voice tight with fear. "We're being followed," Will replied quietly. "One person." "Guard?" Tex asked, positioning himself beside Will. "I don't think so." The footsteps stopped just short of the chamber entrance. Silence stretched, broken only by their own labored breathing and the occasional drip of water from the earthen ceiling. Then a figure emerged from the darkness, black against black, moving with fluid grace. The Crow. Will tightened his grip on the shiv, mind racing through combat scenarios. The masked observer was dangerous. His movements suggested advanced training, but Will had surprise and desperation on his side. The Crow stopped at the chamber's edge, making no move to attack, no move to retreat. His stillness radiating neither threat nor fear. "You followed us," Will said, breaking the silence. "Why?" The Crow remained motionless for a long moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached up and removed his mask. Will's breath caught. The face revealed was younger than he'd expected, scarred along one cheek, with eyes that held not the hatred Will had anticipated, but something far more complex. "I know these tunnels," the Crow said, his English surprisingly good, his voice rasping as if rarely used. "You do not." "You're helping us?" Tex asked incredulously. The crow, no. The man, now that the mask was gone, shook his head slightly. "I am helping myself." "What does that mean?" Will demanded, shiv still ready. "It means," the man replied, "that Bao killed my family when I refused to execute prisoners." His expression hardened. "It means I have waited 2 years for this opportunity." Will studied him, searching for deception. "You want revenge on Bao?" "I want justice," the man corrected, "and to be free of this place." He gestured toward one of the tunnels. "That way leads to a patrol route. That one," he pointed to another, "to death, collapsed 3 months ago. This one," he indicated a third passage, "to the river. Eventually." Will hesitated, weighing their options. Trust this man who had watched them for days? Or rely on Mai Lin's map, which could be outdated or deliberately misleading? "Why should we believe you?" Boone asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the tunnels. The man who had been the crow looked at him dispassionately. "Because I could have called the guards at any time. I did not." It was true. He'd had countless opportunities to expose their escape plan, yet had remained silent. Even this morning, when he'd caught Will examining the tunnel entrance, he had simply walked away. "What's your name?" Will asked. "Once Fan Van Locke," the man replied. "Now, nothing. A ghost." Will made his decision. "Lead us, but I'll be right. Behind you." Locke nodded once, then turned toward the passage he'd indicated. As they followed him deeper into the tunnel network, Will kept the shiv ready, his senses hyper-alert for any sign of betrayal. The tunnel narrowed again, forcing them to crouch, then almost crawl in sections. The air grew thinner, heavier with moisture and the earthy scent of decay. Behind Will, Mouse's breathing had become rapid, verging on panic. "Keep it together," Will murmured over his shoulder. "We're making progress." "It's so dark," Mouse whispered back. I can't breathe." "Yes, you can," Will said firmly. "Count your breaths. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The simple exercise seemed to help, Mouse's breathing gradually steadying as they continued forward. Will wondered, briefly, when he'd begun to care so much about the boy's welfare, when the mission parameters had shifted from escape to protection. The tunnels continued, maze-like in their complexity. Twice, Locke stopped them, pointing out tripwires almost invisible. In the darkness, old traps left from previous conflicts, still lethal despite their age. They had been moving for perhaps 2 hours when the tunnel began to slope upward. Fresh air whispered ahead, carrying the scent of jungle vegetation rather than underground must. "Close," Locke murmured. "But dangerous. Guards patrol riverside." Will nodded, understanding the new risk. Emerging from the tunnels would expose them immediately if they weren't cautious. "How far to the river?" he asked. 300 meters, Locke replied. "Then 5 kilometers downstream to where river bends. American patrol sometimes there. 5 kilometers of hostile jungle, with pursuers certain to follow once their escape was discovered at dawn. The odds were still heavily against them, but far better than they had been inside the camp." The tunnel entrance appeared ahead, a faint graying in the absolute darkness. Locke held up a hand, signaling them to wait as he moved forward to peer cautiously outside. He gestured them forward after a moment. "Clear for now, but must move quickly." One by one, they emerged into the pre-dawn jungle, the eastern horizon just beginning to lighten. Will blinked against even this dim illumination after hours in total darkness. They were in dense vegetation, the river invisible but audible nearby, a steady rushing sound that promised direction and possibly salvation. "That way," Locke indicated, pointing southeast. As they prepared to move out, Will caught a flash of conflict in the former crow's eyes. "You're not coming with us," he realized. Locke shook his head. "I have unfinished business." "With Bao," Will guessed. Locke nodded once. "It ends tonight." Will understood. The man had his own mission, his own demons to exorcise, just as Will had, his people to protect. "Thank you," Will said simply. Locke studied him for a long moment. "We are not so different, you and I," he said finally. Both caught between loyalties. With that cryptic observation, he melted back into the jungle, heading toward the camp they'd left behind. Will turned to the others. Mouse looked exhausted but present, his eyes clear and determined. Tex was steady as always, already scanning their surroundings for threats. Boone stood slightly apart, his expression a complex mixture of guilt and resolve. "We move fast, stay quiet," Will instructed. "The river is our guide and our cover." As they began their journey through the lightning jungle, Will felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They weren't safe, far from it, but they were free. Each step took them farther from captivity, from Bao's psychological games, from the suffocating dread of the camp. Yet even as they pushed forward, Will found himself thinking of those left behind, of Sullivan and Johnson, who would never make this journey, of Mai Lin, whose motives remained enigmatic but whose help had been genuine, of Locke returning to face whatever personal reckoning awaited him. The jungle pressed close around them, humid and alive with sound and movement. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, the possibility of recapture or death, but also hope, slim and fragile, but real. Will led his small band forward, aware that the hunt had only changed form, not ended. Bao would come after them once the escape was discovered. The jungle itself was as much enemy as refuge. But for now they were moving, surviving, together, and that Will realized was victory enough for the moment. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.